Large language models are the telescope of the mind. They give us this view of an intelligence that is quickly becoming larger and more vast than any single human being or even potentially civilization itself. And when you look at something that grand and that vast and that capable, it makes you feel small and afraid. But over time, we've gotten used to this idea that the universe is large and that we're small. And if anything, we've started to look at the beauty of the universe and how vast it is. And I think, and I hope, that we start to look at intelligence and its vastness and its capability. And rather than being afraid that it could be much more than we are today, we look at the beauty of just how vast it can become.
Welcome to the Eric Ries Show. I'm your host. Today we have Jonathan Ross, the founder of Groq, one of the hot AI startups of the moment. They make LPUs, a kind of AI chip. And if you want to imagine starting a very, very difficult startup, try to imagine something that competes head-to-head with Nvidia, with Intel, with AMD. Chip manufacturing. Think of all the difficulties of semiconductor fabrication, of design, supply chain. This one's got it all. Groq was started in 2016, so before the current generative AI craze. And in the interview, Jonathan talks about what it's taken to raise money keep his team motivated through the long march through the wilderness in the desert during that long time when people thought what he was doing was crazy. And like many, many overnight success stories, this one was 8 years in the making. In our conversation, we talked about a lot, obviously, about AI, about the governance challenges, the geopolitics, the philosophy of running a company, but also the practical bits, how to maintain culture and alignment in a startup like this, how to deal with competition, which is really deep-pocketed and sometimes can resort to unscrupulous methods. Most importantly, we talked about Jonathan's long-term vision, how he operationalizes what I call a mission-controlled company, a company that's trying to do something truly great. I'm really happy to bring you this conversation with Jonathan Ross, founder and CEO of Groq. The Eric Ries Show is brought to you by Mercury, the bank account I actually use for my startup. I've been around a lot of startups and a lot of fintech products over the years. People often think the way to simplify the complexity of finance is to add layer upon layer upon layer of software and automations and workflows. And all that winds up with is a really complicated mess. Mercury's figured out the thing that really matters, the bank account. If all of your workflows, all of your automations are driven from the place where the data and the money already are, life gets a lot simpler. Mercury simplifies your financial operations with powerful banking, giving you greater control, precision, and speed so you can operate at your best. We all know speed is the ultimate advantage that startups possess. Your bank account needs to speed you up, not slow you down. Apply in minutes at Mercury.com and join over 200,000 ambitious startups that trust Mercury to simplify their finances and perform at their best. Mercury is a financial technology company, not a bank. Banking services provided by Choice Financial Group and Evolve Bank and Trust, members FDIC. This episode is brought to you by DigitalOcean, the cloud loved by developers and founders alike. Developing and deploying applications can be tough, but it doesn't have to be. Scaling a startup can be a painful road, but it doesn't have to be. When you have the right cloud infrastructure, you can skip the complexity and focus on what matters most. DigitalOcean offers virtual machines, managed Kubernetes, plus new solutions like GPU compute. With a renewed focus on ensuring excellent performance for users all over the world, DigitalOcean has the essential tools developers need for today's modern applications, with the predictable pricing that startups want. Join the more than 600,000 developers who trust DigitalOcean today, with $200 in free credits and even more exclusive offers just for listeners at do.co/Eric. Terms and conditions apply. Jonathan, great to have you here. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Eric. Great to be here.
One of the most important AI projects for me, the kind of like capstone story, is the match of AlphaGo against Lee Sedol. And I feel like there's like a tidbit in that story that's not as well known as it ought to be that involves your role. So I'm wondering if you could kind of take your mind back to that time at Google and tell me if I got this right. My understanding is that the version of AlphaGo that played Lee Sedol, if it had been running on GPUs, it would not have won the match. Is that true?
That's probably true. So what happened was about 30 days before the competition, a member of the TPU team got an email And the email summarized was basically this: we just played a test game. We're going to lose. And we have 30 days. And is your chip as fast as we've heard? And of course, sort of like Ghostbusters, the scene where he's like, if someone asks you, are you a god? You say yes. Well, if someone asks you, is your chip as fast as we've heard? You say yes.
Gotta say yes, yeah.
Exactly. So we ended up having one person from the TPU team go and start actually working on getting the software ported. And we got it done in time and won 4 out of the 5 games. But when we actually went back and had the 48 TPUs play the 170 GPUs, the 48 TPUs won 99 out of 100 games using the exact same software.
So to me, that's like I play Go, so I remember that match extremely well, and it was a really big deal in my world when that happened. And I feel like so much of what has subsequently played out with AI, with large language models, and so many things like kind of recapitulates what we saw with AlphaGo, with AlphaZero. But to me, I would think that would be like kind of like a record scratch moment in your life where it's like, pause. How did I get here? You talk about TPUs and GPUs. Your background is not in chip design and chip engineering. Like, how on earth did you wind up playing this critical part in the AlphaGo challenge from the hardware side? Like, take me back in time. How did you wind up in that spot?
Well, I was a software engineer in New York City, Google New York. I was in ads. I was actually working on building very large scale testing frameworks. And at Google, you would have lunch with other teams. There wasn't really this sort of like compartmentalization.
I remember.
And the speech recognition team happened to be on the 11th floor. I was on the 10th floor. They would come down to the, I think it was the 10th floor where the cafeteria was. So we would, or maybe 8th floor, whatever it was, and we'd bump into each other. I was having lunch at a table. I overheard them saying, we have a speech recognition model that outperforms human beings, but we can't afford to deploy it. And actually around that time, Jeff Dean, the most famous engineer at Google, actually delivered a presentation to the leadership team at Google, which was just 2 slides. Number 1, machine learning finally works. Number 2, we can't afford it. And when Google can't afford something, that's an interesting problem. So I had done a little bit of FPGA work in finance. I was not an EE or electrical engineer. And I convinced that speech recognition team to fund a 20%, give me hardware, give me other stuff, begged, borrowed, and all the other hardware that we needed.
This is Google's famous 20% time independent projects policy.
Or as other people call it, 120% time, or as I like to call it, my MCI plan, free nights and weekends. Yeah, they don't really like you doing 20%. But the reality is it's in document form. You can highlight it. And when HR calls you in and says, I want you working 100% on what we've assigned you to, you can go, no, here's the document that says I'm allowed to spend 20% of my time doing something else, which actually happened.
So I'm not surprised, although it's kind of disappointing to hear.
But anyway, ended up building the original TPU to solve the inference problem. And your analogy to Go and language models is correct, because chess, Go, there's a sequence of moves. And those sequence of moves depend on the previous moves. You can't make the 30th move until you know the 29th. You can't say the 100th word until you know the 99th. So it's a very similar problem, that sort of sequential nature. And unlike, let's talk about one of the big shifts that's happening. I often get asked by VCs and other people, is generative AI the next internet or mobile? And the short answer to this is no. What the internet was information age. It was about taking a piece of data, copying it with high fidelity, and distributing it to the world. And mobile was an example of that, but even better, because now you could reach people where they are, not at a desk. But that's really not too different than the printing press. It's better. It's a larger scaling factor. It's faster distribution, but it's effectively the same idea. And generative AI is different. Generative AI creates something on demand. It is custom to the particular situation. It is not about copying. It's not about data or information. It's about compute. And if you look at search is an information age technology. You build an index, and then someone comes by later, types a query, and then you retrieve from that index, which means, Eric, I can't give you a much better search result. I can give you a little better search result by searching a little deeper in the index, but I'm not going to fundamentally change the quality in order of magnitude.
Once it's good enough, you mean?
Well, just I've already indexed it. Unless I find something better in there, which is a needle in a haystack, it's not going to happen, right? But with computation, it's very different. With generative AI, it's very different. If I am creating something custom for you, if I dedicate twice the compute, 4 times the compute, 1,000 times the compute, the answer can be better. And that's what happened with AlphaGo. An example of that is the famous shoulder hit move in the second game. I don't
The
know
divine move, of course.
Sorry?
The divine move, yeah.
The divine move, where everyone saw that and they're like, wow, that is creative. Well, what that move actually was, it was actually a 1 in 10,000 game move. It had been played in championships before, which is what the training set had. When we went back later and had GPUs play, they never found that move because it was too far down the search. It wasn't intuitive enough. And the TPUs were faster. So they searched a larger portion of the space and they found it consistently. And so having more compute gives a better result because you can explore a larger space. And this is thinking fast, thinking slow. Mm-hmm. And one of the other counterintuitive things about moving into the generative age from the information age, we tend to think of computers as being really good brute force number crunchers. But with generative AI, it's their intuition. Their intuition is better. When you use a large language model, that text that comes out like this really fast, that's its stream of consciousness. It hasn't edited it. That's just literally the one of the most probable outcomes that it's picking each time. Imagine if you could write that well on your first draft with no errors, no spelling error, just like So in a lot of ways, these models are actually more intuitive than a human being and not as analytical.
It's a robot future I don't think anyone quite anticipated. So you've been talking a lot about TPUs versus GPUs. For those that don't know, maybe just to kind of give a little bit of the history too, like what is the difference between a TPU and a GPU? And just, again, how did you come to be designing chips for Google? I mean, that's just like not what your background would have predicted. So yeah, so tell us a little more of the story of how it came to be.
Well, one of the nice cultural things about Google is they were always willing to give something a try. There were actually 3 attempts to build an AI accelerator chip at Google that went on about the same time. One of them was actually led by a Turing Award winner. And I think everyone expected that one to be the one that Google would use. And then there was the TPU, and then there was something else. And the VP that funded it referred to it in these words that he said he funded it out of his slush fund, which was the leftover money from canceled projects. And so he had discretion over it. And one of the most important things was because it was just leftover money, there was no like, oh, this has to work. And there was this freedom where we're like, okay, we'll just build whatever we think makes sense. And we went at it completely de novo, clean slate. I didn't know chip design. Most of the team that we brought on did later, but that was after the architecture was selected. And I remember there was a point at which that Turing Award winner was giving a talk somewhere. And he said, I don't know who came up with this systolic array in the TPU, but they must be really old because no one uses systolic arrays. And I'm like, oh, it's called a systolic array. It just seemed to make sense. And so there's this element of when you hire a bunch of experts, they know all the ways that things are supposed to be done. And if you're trying to do something different, you really want to free people up. You don't want to overly constrain them, say, thou shalt be successful. And like, here's how it's done. And in the end, what ended up happening was so when we first did this, no one expected TPU to be successful. And it ended up getting deployed widely. And then there was this realization, oh no, this is super important for Google. Let's go hire in some experts. Mm-hmm. And then you notice that the subsequent TPUs start to perform a lot more like GPUs. As like when the first TPU came out, it was about 10 times faster and 10 times cheaper, and also much lower power. But then all of a sudden, it was life and death. We couldn't fail, and all of a sudden, it became like everything else.
That's so common in corporate innovation that the more pressure you put on a thing, more important it is, the less risks you can take, and therefore the less actual innovation that you get.
Well, and I think people don't really understand what risk is. You can assign a risk value to anything. So whenever someone says this is too risky, I'll say, I'm going to be the most conservative person. If we don't get this done quickly, we're toast. Mm-hmm. That's where I can't accept risk. I can take risk in all sorts of other ways, but it's got to get done quickly. And that changes the conversation a little bit. But people really like, what are your constants? What are your variables? And it's funny, you'll be in a meeting and people will be at loggerheads with each other. And when you really look at the conversation, it's just that some people have a different set of constants than other people.
So let's talk about Groq, because Groq is like your classic overnight success that's been kind of a lot of years in the making. And I remember, I don't know what it was, 6 months ago. I don't remember exactly when it was, but it was a moment in time when Groq was just absolutely everywhere. All the AI people I knew were talking about it nonstop. And for those who haven't seen, groq.com, you've got just one of the coolest demos. AI is known for its pretty impressive demos, and yet yours is really remarkable. And what's remarkable about it, for those who've played with ChatGPT or Claude or one of the more popular LLMs, if you use Microsoft Copilot or something like that, you're kind of accustomed to the cadence of you ask it a question and you wait a minute and then you get this like unbelievable answer you can't believe. But there's a lot of waiting involved. And if you check out the Groq demo, the thing you will be just unbelievably blown away by is its speed. Just it is able to produce those caliber of answers, but almost instantaneously. And it's funny because we're used to software being fast. We're used for software being able to do things instantaneously. And yet when it comes to generative AI, when it comes to large language models, we've like reaccustomed ourselves, to like floppy disk style waiting for things to load. So talk a little bit about your decision to leave Google, to start Groq, like explain a little bit of what the company does, and just especially for those who are not as familiar with AI, who are not as familiar with the architecture of TPUs, LPUs, GPUs, like just give a little bit of a layman's introduction to the company.
Well, the decision to leave was pretty easy. There's so many different reasons to leave and so many different reasons to stay. There is no one reason, but the one most relevant to your audience is I was in Google X. I was in the rapid eval team, and that's the team that comes up with all the crazy ideas at Google X. And to their credit, they pride themselves with having a quick turnover rate. I don't think too many people stay there more than 2 years because they tend to select people who are very entrepreneurial. And success, they got one. But the realization was I had thought that the TPU was a startup. I'm like, ooh, I did a startup inside of Google. And I didn't realize how ridiculous those words were until I actually did a startup. But the difference between doing something within a company and outside of a company is as follows. When at Google X, I had to get a VC to invest. I had to get Astro, Sergey, and one or two other people to sign off. But it was an and. And in VC, there are thousands of venture capitalists, and it's an or. All you need is one. And so your ability to get something funded increases dramatically when you leave one of these companies. On the other hand, there's a little bit of risk, right? You're not guaranteed that you're going to continue to draw a paycheck. But the reality is big companies cancel projects all the time. Like, it's so hilarious. I'll talk to an engineer and they're like, I don't know, a startup's risky. And I'm like, the project you're on is more likely to be canceled than our startup is to fail.
Yeah, it's a very counterintuitive thing, the way people think about risk in their career. And I've counseled, I don't know how many hundreds of people now over the years, who've thought about leaving a company to start a company. I've seen all the different permutations of it. And it's really interesting to me that people who perceive entrepreneurship as risky and then they get laid off, or they get reorged into a job they hate, or they just can't ever get the funding for the project they want, year in, year out. And that's seen as the low risk option, which I just think tells you something really fascinating about our society and how we value, how we think about risk and how we think about personal risk in people's careers.
Well, I think this is the Nassim Taleb Black Swan thing, which is everything has risk. So why not just take the options where the risk is actually priced to your advantage as opposed to where it's not? Because if you invest in a, unassailable large tech company like Google, which can never possibly ever lose, there's no risk priced in, right? Now, all of a sudden, generative AI, and there's a bunch of companies nipping at Google's heels. Now, Google has a pretty good chance of succeeding and surviving, but all of a sudden that risk becomes apparent. Now, If you invest in something that has very clear risk, that is priced in, it's a much better deal for you. The other one that the stat that I love, and I don't know if it's true, but you might actually know. But I've heard it so much, I think it might as well be true, which is the average 100th employee of a startup actually does better financially than the average startup founder.
On average, sure, yeah.
On average.
Yeah, on average, of course, yeah, because the risk level at the number of startups that make it to 100 employees is already such a tiny, small sample. The selection bias is way in your favor.
Exactly. And so most people are looking to be like a first 10 employee at a startup. But if you want to take that next step in risk and go from being in a large corporation that moves slow, don't just go off and start your own startup. Spend 2 to 4 years or whatever at a 100-person startup or a 300-person startup and get a sense for it, because it's sort of like dipping your toe into warm water rather than jumping into hot water, right? It's more chaotic.
There's lots of ways to do it. Yeah, that's true. And definitely the risk reward, you can find, there's people treat it like a binary, but of course there's so many places on that risk reward spectrum you can be. Okay, but tell me about Groq. Tell me what it is, and tell me just a bit of the founding story.
Well, part of the founding story was after the TPU became public, I was inundated by hyperscalers asking me to come to them and build them a chip. And I actually wasn't that interested in doing a chip again. I had done a chip. I was even trying to do a chip while I was at Google X. And I also did a bunch of other things. I did something in biomechanical engineering. I even tried to do some sort of like contracting. I even tried to do something in the law at Google. It was crazy. You could try anything you wanted, right? But I had no intention of ever doing another chip again. And right when I went out, two things happened. The TPU paper came out, which I didn't write, I wasn't part of, but my name was listed a lot of times under the, if you want to learn more, read this stuff section, not at the author part, but in the, if you actually want to learn how it worked. And that got me a lot of attention from VCs. And the second one was all these hyperscalers who'd learned about it was in production for a year and nobody knew about it. It's crazy. Like, I just can't believe something that, because it was more than half of Google's compute and people didn't really realize it. It's insane. And so then they all started reaching out saying, come build this for us. And one of them made the case at the time, this was 2016, 2015, whatever it was. At this point, Google has a fundamental compute advantage. China is probably going to be not too far behind. It's not good for the world for there to be only 2 players in AI. And I'm like, that makes a lot of sense. And then they said, so come join us and make it 3. And I'm like, ooh, that does not make so much sense. Let's go make sure that everyone has access. So like the pitch was good. Unfortunately, the conclusion was I need to go do this and make this available to everyone. And we spent a lot of time at Groq on usability, which is not a key factor in designing chips. It's sort of like people designing race cars and they're all engine designers. And they're like, why would we put air conditioning in there? It just makes the car go slower, right? Versus someone who uses the car, a driver, who's going to have a lot of different take on it. And I was a software engineer who just happened to build a chip. So we spent the first 6 months on the compiler. And as a result, we ended up building a very different architecture, but one that was easy to compile to. So I would say at this point, other than Nvidia, we probably have more software running on the Groq LPU, which is our chip, the language processing unit, than any other accelerator. Probably all the others combined besides Nvidia. And the second one was realizing that we were going to have to scale. Because of that experience with AlphaGo, the realization was the deeper you could search, the better the answers. Now, we didn't know that it was going to be language, but we knew that it was going to be sequential. We knew that it was going to be strategic in how it operated. And then we built that and nothing. And like, it was like,
you started the company in what? In 2016, right?
2016. So seven.
Yeah.
So
I want everyone who's listening to really process this, because, I would guess if you're listening to this interview, you're very likely to be excited about AI and want to know about its possibility, or possibly worried about it, certainly excited about it, definitely know about it. Think back to when you first got excited about this new wave of AI. There's a few AI researchers, who will be like, I've been focused on this for many years, but many of us got excited about AI, 2 years ago, right? When GPT-3 came out, GPT-4 came out, when ChatGPT came out. Like, those are the things that have dramatically popularized AI and have totally changed people's perception of what is possible in AI. Now, take your mind back to 2016, 8 years ago. how excited were you about the possibilities of AI? How obvious was it to you that we were like, just a few years away from passing the Turing test, like by a lot? What was it like to be in the wilderness during those years when it was seen as really not obvious what you were doing?
I think at this moment we can pan to someone from the TV show Survival with the long beard and whatnot, and living in the woods. And they're, it was terrible. Like, we had retention issues.
Of course.
All of the other, competitors, because they had nothing else to talk about, would just talk about how bad each other competitor was doing rather than how good they were doing. So we were just constantly inundated with, this is how bad Groq is, and we would have to answer that. Every single meeting I would have with a VC, I could tell who they had spoken to most recently based on the questions they would ask. And it was always all this stuff they had stacked up. And, we had, all the typical problems. But then all of a sudden, open source LLMs. And internally at this point, everyone's like, yeah, this isn't going to work. I'm like, no, this is like perfect this is literally what we were thinking. I mean, we didn't realize it was going to be language, but like large scale inference needs a lot of chips. This was what we were built for. And at that point, the team was so demoralized, we actually had a bunch of people quit and say, no, like, actually one person rounded up a bunch of people and tried to go to the board and say, fire me. Because I'm like misleading people that we can get performance. No, it was terrible. And then all of a sudden we get the speed and it starts to trend towards exactly what we predicted it would be. And now the team's buying in, and I got to credit our compiler lead big time with this, because he had a lot of credibility. He said we could do it. The team rallied behind him. And next thing you know, we're setting speed records. And then it was all about, well, wait a second, we don't want to show how good we are. And I'm like, why not? No, seriously, because everyone's like, well, as soon as we show how good we are, everyone else is going to do it. And I'm like, great, it'll be a race. It'll be exciting. It'll be fun. And everyone's going to tune in. And so we released at about 100 tokens per second. We knew that someone had gotten to about 78 tokens per second on Llama 270 billion. We were at 100. Mm-hmm. Everyone's like, don't do it until we get to 300. We know we can get to 300. We know we can get higher. And I'm like, no, let's make it a race. So we launched, and then to our surprise, no one hit 100 tokens per second for a long time. By that point, we were past 200. We were getting close to 300. And we were like, should we wait a little? Like, no one's catching up. And then we're like, no, finally, we're like at close to 300. We're like, we just have to release this because it's been too long. We released that. And people are just really struggling to keep up on the latency. But at that point, we didn't have enough capacity because we'd focused on the latency, and we couldn't really make it public. So then we started focusing on also having the throughput, and then we put it on our website. And all of a sudden it went from, yeah, Groq is this toy, to, wait a sec, but I can use it. Mm-hmm. And I use other things and they're slow, and I use this and it's fast. And that sort of tactileness, the ability to go, the visceral sense that everyone got, was the game changer. All of a sudden, it was less about benchmarks, less about counter position. It was like, this is fast. I like this. I want this. Give me this. And in that first week where we went viral, the previous week we had 8,000 new users. The next week we had 400,000 new users on our website. And at that point, it's kind of like, okay, I guess all that FUD that Groq can't like handle throughput or scale, maybe that's wrong. And from that point, it started to become serious.
Yeah. And then once it starts to snowball, it's really intense. I really like talking to founders with monstrous ambition and who are doing something that everyone knows to be impossible. And this, I like this story especially because, like, starting a new semiconductor company, a new general purpose chip, is like such a problem that is known to be impossible that, like, it's taught. I've been in business school classrooms where when people talk about what kinds of startups to start and not start, like that can be started and not started, competing with Nvidia and Intel and AMD, it's like we already have these like dominant near monopoly level players, the capital expenditure necessary to build semiconductor fabs, the combination of technical risk and market risk, at the same time. So everyone knows that it's impossible. Now, my favorite founders are the ones that hear something's impossible and say, well, that'll be a pretty good competitive advantage. That's the ultimate moat. If everyone knows it can't be done, then no one else will be crazy enough to try. But like Were you at all daunted by the fact that, you were up against such strategic barriers that most people would say what you're doing can't be done? You must have heard that from lots of VCs and other folks that you met with who just thought it was.
I actually agree with everyone. You should not compete with Nvidia, Intel, or anyone else. You should do something different. If you're competing, then you're doing it wrong. And whenever a VC asks me, because we've got great performance, and their next question is typically, some of the big customers that we talk to, they're like, should I still buy GPUs? As if they should be asking me. And I'm like, absolutely. Every single GPU that you can get, you should buy because you need it for training. Now let's talk about inference at scale, because GPUs are not built for scale. They use HBM, which is this scarce commodity. NVIDIA is the largest buyer of supercapacitors in the world.
Explain what HBM is, just real quick.
HBM is a type of memory. It is the the best way to understand how these AI chips work. Think of a car factory where you're building cars, and there's an assembly line. It's a really long assembly line, right? These large language models are massive, and it's not just that you're doing billions of operations. It's that you're also doing them with sort of thousands of gates in between where you have to finish this before you can go to the next one. So there's this real sequential component. And what happens is you move through this factory building this car or this token, and you have to go through tens or hundreds or thousands of billions of parameters, which is sort of like hundreds or thousands or tens of billions of stations in an assembly line. If you had an assembly line that was 1 million square feet to build a car, but you had a factory that was 100,000 square feet, what you would have to do is you'd have to tear down the assembly line after each stage, set up the next stage, and then run the cars through over and over again. And that takes a lot of time to set up and tear down, set up and tear down. And you're limited by the rate at which you can bring in the new assembly line parts. HBM is the fastest, least expensive way to bring that new assembly line in so you can reconfigure it quickly. But there's a faster and better way. Why not just build 1 million square feet of assembly line and just run your cars through nonstop? And so that's what we did. We actually built, and so one of the things that is very counterintuitive, and you must have a bunch of counterintuitive things in whatever you do that, there's a couple of ways to be disruptive. Number one, do something that others can't do. I don't know that there are too many things that others can't do. People are pretty smart. Then there's do things that they don't want to do. From a business point of view, it disrupts their business. That's the classic sort of Clayton Christensen approach to disruption. And then there's my approach to disruption, which is do things that people don't believe actually works, even when you're showing it to them and it works, right? Literally, we show people how fast we are. We show people we've had.
I'm well familiar with this phenomenon. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, but yeah, it doesn't work. No, you used it.
We need to have a special club for founders of companies where the competitive differentiation is that it exists. And then the marketing challenge is not that it's better, but that it's possible. Like that it actually, like you're like, I'm showing it to you, I'm looking at it, and people have such blindness. It's such a great example of cognitive dissonance that they can't believe what they see with their own eyes because everyone knows that it's impossible.
Exactly.
So how can you be showing it to them? If it's impossible, it can't possibly exist.
Exactly. And so we go in there and we're like, okay, so we got to run this model on like 700, 600 chips, whatever. And they're like, that can't work. And I'm like, no, that demo I just did for you, it works. And not only that, we're charging you less than anyone else because it's cheaper for us. And people are writing like analytical reports about how expensive we are. And we're just like, no, we're not. Like, but it's fun to watch this. And that inability to believe that what they're seeing is real is great. But you have to have really small slices of unit economics for that to work. And I think this is one of the reasons why chips are so hard to innovate in. Because if you're asking someone to put up a $10, $100 million or $1 billion check, they got to know that it's going to work.
Yeah.
And that makes it almost impossible to do counterintuitive things, which is why we forward integrated to the point where we put up our own cloud. And now we have 60,000 developers in less than 30 days on our developer console. And because we're not shipping them millions of dollars of hardware, it's not a big ask for them to try it. And then they try it and they love it. But if we had, I don't think you can build a truly innovative chip company without forward integrating to smaller units that you can sell, just because you're never going to convince anyone.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's such a classic example of, people always say minimum viable product can't work if the thing is complicated or difficult or expensive. And here's like such a great example of like, I always try to explain to people that it needs to be faster than the underlying cycle time of whatever you're competing with. So it doesn't have to be fast compared to a dating app or whatever. It has to be fast compared to what customers are accustomed to doing. So by being able to create, to spend 6 months on working on the compiler and to be able to like really get to a demo that customers can understand. I mean, what was your initial funding? It was not that high, right? You didn't raise billions of dollars to build semiconductor fabs out of the gate, right?
No, it started at 10 million. Yeah. And while we intended to start with the software anyway, that was also a good motivator for us to focus on that first, because we're like, well, we can't tape out.
Yeah, scarcity forces you to do it.
Yeah, I mean, we already intended to focus on the software anyway, but that was just a good reinforcing function. Actually, I would recommend that you don't raise too much money at first, because otherwise you get rich person's disease, where all of a sudden you start spending. Well. Actually, this is a good one. I would say Groq has had a bunch of near-death experiences up until now, and every single one of those has made us stronger. I think this is why you get the strongest companies when they've been through some of those winters, because they learn how to deal with that, and then they don't get surprised when all of a sudden the rug gets pulled out from under them.
Yeah, I've noticed that pattern. If you look like startups that have had to pivot multiple times or have had multiple near-death experiences, you actually see a time cycle compression. They tend to get to the moment of the next crisis faster because they learned a lot from the first crisis. They're like, well, we're not going to waste time building stuff that ultimately we're going to throw away because there's going to be another crisis. They start to internalize the idea that crisis is actually not bad. It's the natural state of affairs. There's going to be black swans. There's going to be unexpected events. There's going to be setbacks.
And crisis is opportunity. So we have our own people spec or leveling guide, and it's not like anyone else. As usual, it's not like anyone else's. And in one of the dimensions of it, there's 6 different levels, and 3 of them have to do with luck. We actually hire for luck. So return on luck, making lemonade out of lemons. These are different levels. And the joke is, so how do you hire for luck? Well, you randomly sort resumes into 2 piles and you throw one out. But in all seriousness, it's about that opportunity. Like, I can't tell you how many times an opportunity has come across Groq and we talked ourselves out of it. And
yeah. We're really good at that. Human mind is amazing at that.
Yeah. And it's like, that can't work, whatever. Like, we actually talked ourselves out of LLMs at one point. And we were much slower to move to that than we should have been, even though it's literally what we built for, because we had a series of like 3 different groups of engineers going, that's not what we're good at, despite pushing and saying, no, this is literally what we built for, and architecturally. And when you finally get past that and you start to realize it's about that return on luck, as Jim Collins puts it, and he's got a chapter on this, then you start to hire for that, and you look for people who are like, anytime there is a potential glimmer of good luck, they pounce on it, and they're like a rabid dog and they won't let go of it, right? Like, because they're hungry. They don't think there's another good thing floating by.
This episode is brought to you by Runway. You ever feel like you're the only one who gets your company's numbers? Like, really gets it? Explaining it to other people can feel like a drag. It's unbelievable to me how many founders, their team doesn't understand how the business works. Well, that's where Runway comes in. It's not just for you, it's for your whole team. By integrating with hundreds of tools to pull in your data, having everything in one place makes it much easier for the whole team to understand how their individual decisions impact the overall business. This is how you build metrics you can believe and you can trust. It's all drag and drop, everything updates instantly, you get real-time investor reports, and everyone can play with the model. When people understand the model, they make smarter decisions. If you want to see how Runway can give your team the clarity they need, head to runway.com/Eric for a demo and your first 2 months free. So you have a really long-term vision. I would say like kind of unusually so, just the time horizon you have to operate on and have had to operate on from the beginning. Like, that's not a great fit with our modern kind of our modern contemporary ethos is very short-term focused, quarterly focused. Many investors have short-term IRR targets. So like, yeah, what have you done to kind of protect that long-term vision from folks who've kind of push it more in the conventional short-term direction?
First, let's talk about how long-term. So I think some people look at a 3-month or 1-quarter horizon, like most public companies. Some people look at a 1, 2, 3 years, some people even 5 or 10 years. And Grok has an infinite time horizon. We make decisions based on infinity. Like, what do we need to do for Grok to maximize as it asymptotes forever, which is going to be beyond my lifetime, beyond the lifetime of anyone at Grok. And the reason you do that is it's a fundamental advantage. When you think longer term, it is very painful in the short term, but you will eventually win. And as long as you can take all that pain and make it through, it is the optimal strategy. Now, a lot of this is psychology. When first starting Grok, I was told by some really smart people, but I didn't believe them at the time, and now I do, that being a founder is largely about maintaining your own psychology. And one of the things that I say at Grok a lot is, and I got this from a famous coach, I'm going to make a lot of decisions, and a lot of those decisions you won't like, and I won't like, but they will always be the best decisions for Grok. Once you get that alignment, life gets a lot easier. So when we talk to investors, when we talk to new employees or candidates, we always set the reality for them in, we're not looking to sell Grok. This is not going to be a quick buck. We're not looking to go public soon because we don't want quarterly stuff. If we can find a way to have a long-term outlook when going public, we will totally do it. Right now, it's about making sure that employees at Grok get liquidity, right? That's important. They're putting their lives into this. They need to get something out of it, but also maintaining control and maintaining that long-term vision. Our mission is to preserve human agency in the age of AI. And quarterly pressures for financial reporting and preserving human agency in the age of AI, same thing. Not really. Like, totally different objectives. So I think a lot of founders focus on control. They really want control. They say, I want all the votes. I want to control the board and all that. And at Grok, we've done something a bit different. We've hired a bunch of independent board members. All but one of our board members is independent. And each one of them has such a good reputation that they would never harm their own reputation just for Grok. And when you get a bunch of board members like that, it gives you license to go and pick the next board member who's really good. And it's about that competence. But then the other side of this is, even if you have control, look at what happened at Uber. Right or wrong, it wasn't necessarily going that well from a culture point of view, so probably right. But right or wrong, the founder had total control, didn't have to leave, and a lot of pressure was put on them to leave. And so
founders often underestimate how much pressure can be brought to bear, even if they have formal control.
Well, and think about, of all people, Travis Kalanick is probably one of the least vulnerable to pressure. And if he, left his position under that pressure. So I don't think that's the right way to set things up. I think it's about getting the same aligned expectations. And so when an investor invests in Grok, I tell them, if someone comes to us with a reasonable offer to buy Grok, we're going to be unreasonable. But if they come to us with a unreasonable offer, we're going to be reasonable. And the reality is, because our technology is so hard to understand, people only ever come to us with reasonable offers. They can't think far, like they don't understand. Like, at this point, we've now gotten to a point where we realize the only two entities that can scale the supply chain for generative AI are Nvidia and Grok, because we have orthogonal supply chains. We don't use the HBM that we referred to earlier. We don't use the interposers. We don't use the supercaps. We use 1/10 the power. It's by the end of 2025, we expect that more than half of the world's generative AI compute will actually be provided by Grok. Now, investors looking at this, they're like, that's an interesting story, but I don't fully understand every single part of it. Same with the large hyperscalers and everyone else that we're working with. And so they can't get to a point where they could ever come to an offer that's reasonable from the inside because we understand it very well. And so that formulation means that no one's coming in with a check large enough for us to ever go, oh yeah, that's unreasonably large, we'll be reasonable. But because I set that expectation, anytime someone comes in, and it happens on a weekly basis where they're like, so would you be open to maybe joining us and helping? And we're like, sure, make an unreasonable offer, and I'll take it to the board and whatever. And they just can't. They don't know what is unreasonable yet.
So I'm really interested. Groq's always fascinated me as a company that has to be trustworthy for many different stakeholders. Especially now as we see the geopolitical pressures that you're under. I can imagine how many frequent flyer miles you've logged now trying to talk to the governments of the world, tell them understand what is coming. But also, just the conventional issues of you're asking customers to put their most precious data through your software. We've obviously seen examples of foreign governments infiltrating supply chains and putting spyware into fundamental, semiconductor technology. So there's like a lot of trust issues here. And I guess I would feel like if I was one of your major customers and I had built a trust relationship with you, even the idea that you would sell out to an unreasonable offer would actually make me kind of nervous. Like, wait a second, I can build up trust with you, but why I have to trust a mythical, hypothetical, future owner. And if you limit the range of buyers to nation states and their proxies, I don't know that that's necessarily an improvement in your trustworthiness. So, have you thought about the mechanisms by which you will defend that mission against, these kinds of pressures in the future?
That's a very good question. And as it is, I don't think any sovereign entity would be permitted by the U.S. to acquire Groq. So that's just off the table, right? What we haven't gotten into at this point is not only have we innovated on I think people really underestimate how much there is beyond product. There's a saying I love, which is first-time founders focus on product, second-time founders focus on distribution. But when you're building a physical thing, you also have to think about supply chain. Yeah. And when you're building the kind of thing that we're building, you also have to think about geopolitics. And our chip, the one that's super fast, the one that's setting speed records, that has gotten us 60,000 developers in our developer console, that's a 14 nanometer chip fabbed in upstate New York in the US and packaged in Canada.
It's how it's like 10 generations behind, right?
It's not 10, but it's old. It's long in the tooth. At this point, no one's going.
Nvidia, what are they? 5 nanometers now? 4 nanometers?
4. Actually,
yeah.
Their previous chip was 4, and their new chip is 4. They're struggling to move forward on that. And so 4 is cutting edge. We're 14, but we're made in the U.S., which means that we have a much safer supply chain given some of the concerns. But even if you were to fab your LPU, GPU, whatever in the US, where you're going to get your memory? Well, that HBM memory we talked about is only made in Korea. Where are your supercaps made? Where's all this other stuff made? So we also assemble in North America. There's a few components that aren't in North America, but those are commodity things that we can swap out, and we're not overly concerned. But we're working to bring it 100% in. And that gives us a very unique selling proposition in terms of customers, because our supply chain would not be as disrupted as others. And yeah, it would be disrupted, but ours would be the least disrupted. So where is everyone going to rally behind to make sure that we can continue to? It's going to be Groq. It's not going to be one of the other large makers of chips, because they can't survive a major disruption to the supply chain. So you're always looking for these other reasons besides just, a product's amazing, but it's all this other stuff too. And it's just, 16-dimensional chess.
Yeah, it's also a really important point that people think their governance is whatever it says on paper, but also your governance is who has power over you, which suppliers and vendors and investors, who can bring pressure to bear. We saw some high-profile examples recently of pressure being brought to bear from unexpected quarters and collapsing the on-paper governance. I think it's smart that you're thinking about that. I want to go back to something you said before about, you're talking about you don't want to be acquired, and you, if you go public, you don't want to do it in such a way that you're having to think quarterly. That's obviously playing my tune. I have spent a lot of time thinking about that. But talk a little bit about what you want out of, like, if you could wave a magic wand and the capital markets worked in a way that was supportive to you and your vision. Sounds to me like your experience so far is that what we have today is not what you're looking for. What would you want it to be?
I would want to tackle both control and interest, two different dimensions. The control side, you want to align the control incentives and not just say, the founder gets control, but what is it that really matters? It's that long-term vision. So I think control should increase with how long you hold equity. It's that long, you could tell me you have long-term plans, but that's not the case. An activist, their job is not to maximize the value of the company in the long term. What they do is they maximize in the short term. They will come in and they will go, ooh, if we make this change, the stock will pop. How does that work? Why isn't it long term? Because the value of the equity is actually the maximum of all the different time horizons that someone is willing to trade that equity at. And so if someone is willing to pay more in the short term than in the long term, then the equity value is based on that short term. Now, if in the long term it looks like this, but in the short term it looks like this, the long term matters more. But if this happens, then the short term sets the value. Now, you can take actions to pop up the short term value, but that lowers the long term, even though the long term could have been higher, even given the total discounted cash flow and all that. And there's just this group of investors that specialize in making things pop in the short term, taking some money, and that's just not good for capital markets. That's why countries with really long-term outlooks are doing really well versus what should be much more nimble companies. So what I would like is some sort of way where you can penalize short-term trades where they don't make sense. The problem with that is then the exchanges would be unhappy because they make their money on each trade.
How about that?
But you shouldn't penalize the exchanges. You should change their incentive. What is it Munger says? Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome, right? Mm-hmm. If you incentivize people on every trade, they're going to focus on making every trade. If you incentivize people on holding for the long term, they will focus on holding for the long term, making those long-term decisions and giving an overall advantage to the company or entity.
We'll put a link in the show notes. Obviously, LTSE has pioneered something called long-term voting. We had a proposal to do just what you're describing many years ago. We'll dig it up so folks can read about how it is done. But you're exactly right. Everyone in the current financial system profits by transaction volume, and when transaction volume rules everything, you get these very specific behaviors. Talk a little bit about how you've managed the culture of alignment inside the company. Do you use long-term compensation instruments? How do you do your internal reviews? Like how do you get your employees to be thinking in this long-term way when it's, especially with the AI frenzy that's going on, it's very natural for people to be thinking short-term.
Communicate. Just make sure that you're very clear. You have to have a simple message. The simpler, the better, the easier it is to align. Right now, everyone at Groq actually has one of these tokens on them, one of these coins. And what it says is 25 million, because we're going to get to 25 million tokens per second by the end of the year. And then it says, make it real, make it now, make it wow on the other side. And so if someone makes a proposal and it doesn't help with this, anyone could just put their coin on the table and say that. And they can ask, like, how does it help with this? And it sounds silly to distill it down to such a simple message, but that is the hard part about leadership and getting alignment. It's finding that thing that if you do it, you're going to be successful. And the reason that number is that would, if we do that by the end of this year, then we're going to have as much compute capacity as the largest entity had 1 year prior. And from that point forward, we'll just ramp. And that's why we expect, by the end of this year, we will be one of the most significant players. By the end of next year, we will provide more than half the world's generative AI inference compute.
So just tell us a little bit, like speculate for a minute. Tell me where this is all headed. I've heard you talk about, but on previous conversations, you've talked about having basically taking the cost of inference down to zero, such that not that it's literally zero. There's still an electron. There's still the issue of moving the electrons around, but that such that the computational power that is currently reserved to a very few would be so commonplace that we would treat it, like people in the developed world treat tap water, or flicking on the lights is not a significant cost of something you have to worry about. So to me, what I hear stuff like that, my mind immediately goes to freeways. Everyone always thinks if I have traffic on a freeway, if I make the freeway bigger, then I'll have less traffic. I'll get there faster. And if you look at the data, what happens is if you make the traffic less, then more people drive because now it's more convenient to drive, and you get more traffic than you had before. And I always think about there must be a range of use cases and possibilities that computation can be deployed against it. Today are prohibitively expensive. I mean, you started with even the conversation that there's stuff that's too expensive for Google, and I know that many of us say if it's too expensive for Google, like who can afford it? No, it's like literally out of reach, out of reach of kings and lords and even Google. When those things become at first possible, then affordable, then commonplace, like what's that going to mean?
Our mission is to preserve human agency in the age of AI. To do that, we need to be in the conversation. We need to be able to say what we need our opinion heard. And the best way to do that is to produce most of the world's AI compute. Every time you make compute cheaper, people buy more. This is called Jevons paradox. In the 1860s, this Englishman wrote a treatise on coal, where he noted that every time coal or steam engines got more efficient, people bought more coal. Hence the paradox, because if they're more efficient, why are they buying more? And the answer is, when you make a steam engine more efficient, it reduces the OpEx. When you reduce the OpEx, it actually increases the number of activities that are in the money
profitable for.
That are profitable. Therefore, people do more things. And with compute, over the last 60 years, almost like clockwork, roughly every decade, compute gets about 1,000 times cheaper. People buy 100,000 times as much of it, spending 100 times as much. And so one of our missions at Groq is to drive the cost of compute to zero. The cost, not the total spend, because it doesn't converge, it diverges. The cheaper we make it, the more people spend. And so over the next decade, we want to drive the cost down for generative AI 1,000x. We actually think that will cause 100x spend increase. Now, to preserve human agency, we want to make sure that everyone has access. And if you remember earlier when I said the difference between information age and generative age is that in generative age, you can actually improve the result by giving more compute. If there are a couple of entities out there that have much more access to compute, they're going to get better results. They're going to have an advantage. And we don't think that that's good for humanity. We want to make sure that there's a lot of voices, a lot of opinions, that there isn't control from a small number of entities. And that means giving everyone access to relatively low cost generative AI compute, which is why we're actually driving the cost of compute down. If you look at any of the third-party benchmarks, not only are we the fastest, we're also the least expensive. We've priced the lowest, and we're going to continue to do that. In fact, for the U.S. government, one of our missions is to find a way to price the same for U.S. government as we do commercially. And there's a lot of waste. There's a lot of certification. You have to do a lot of other things where people are like, "Oh, it's government. You just charge them more." and we go, you know what? Actually, that comes out of our pocket because we're trying to get the price the same. And so you're taking money. It's not just going to get passed to the government, right? And you just have to be really hard-nosed about this stuff and do the right. Does it make sense to charge the government more? No. So why would you just go and do that? Why wouldn't you drive it down? So we're trying to drive and think about the benefits to society if the U.S. government could reduce all that toil. Like the DMV, if you could just walk in, say, I need a license renewed, and it's like, oh, I've got all this information. All I need to know is this one thing. What's the answer? Oh, okay, great. Here's your license, as opposed to all these forms. But as we drive that cost down, it enables new applications. It enables more people to enter the AI economy. And it makes sure that we don't end up having a sort of dystopian future of a small number of people who get to have all the say.
All right, let me hit you with a lightning round of a couple things, because what my favorite thing about doing these interviews is I get to research guests, and I get to see interviews you've done before and stuff. So I picked up some things that you've said that I just found really fascinating. I just want to ask you about. You answer short or long as you see fit. Fair?
Fair.
Okay. One of my absolute favorites. You said that 10x is easier than 10%. What does that mean?
When you do 10%, everyone is trying to do 10%. So all the ways to do 10% have already been exhausted. When you set your sights on 10x, no one is competing with you. It is way easier to get a 10x than a 10%.
You had a kind of a similar thing, but I kind of feel like this actually in some ways different. So I want to ask you about this one too. You said you often tell people that can't possibly be right because if it was, everyone would do it.
No, I never say that ever. What happens is when I'm in a meeting and we start talking about something that we could do, and someone says that can't possibly be true because if it was true, everyone would do it. I go, whoa, wait a second. Mm-hmm. High expected value if that's true. And how many people dismiss this idea because of exactly what you said? So as an example, the first person who ever quit Groq, they quit because they said there is no possible way we could get the wire densities that we're talking about in our chip. Because if we did, everyone would do it.
Everyone would be doing it. Yeah.
Everyone would be doing it. And they quit. And we got more wire density. And that's
that is like such a classic human psychology. Do you have a pet theory for why people make that wrong inference all the time?
I don't know. I mean, I hear it a lot, but I always just get excited. When I hear that, I'm like, opportunity. Now, we could be wrong, but you just said that this is incredibly valuable, and you just said you want to dismiss it without looking at it. That, to me, is an opportunity.
Okay. You said that if you're not feeling fear, then you're not doing anything important.
So that's true. And every one of the sort of values that we have, or every one of the dimensions in our people spec, is based on overcoming a fear. And people don't realize that they're operating out of fear. This is the pernicious thing about fear. Mm-hmm. They will back away from an idea and they'll say, no, that doesn't make sense. And what they really mean is, I'm afraid. I don't think that's going to work. Examples are, we should go and, we just did a press release. And so Nvidia announced that they were 30x faster. And we looked at what they had released and we're like, no, we're still faster. And our head of marketing, Andy Cunningham's like, well, why don't we just say that? And I'm like, done. And everyone's like, you can't just have a press release that says we're still faster. And we're like, why not? We're like, because you can't. It has to be long. It has to be like a lot of words. And we're like, okay, we'll put it in the boilerplate because they literally won't accept it unless you do that. But it'll just be, we're still faster. And it was so different. It got noticed. And at GTC, one of the participants asked Jensen, is Groq still faster? And he had to answer, which had we done a really long press release, no one, right? So, but there was a lot of fear around that. And almost everything that you don't do out of fear. You never go, oh gosh, I am so glad we didn't try all those different things. Like, actually, here's another way to think about it. There are times where it's really good that you don't do something. But of all the things that you regret, if you had two piles and you're regretting the things that you didn't do and you're regretting the things that you did do, there are certainly people who are in the regret the things you did do pile. There are people who lean that way too much. But founders tend to be in the regret what you didn't do. They're cautious, they're careful, your team is. And the more people you put together in a room, the more the fear grows, because fear, fear amplifies. All it takes is one person being afraid, and then the entire group is afraid.
Contagious. Yeah, we all get afraid.
So your job as a founder is to overcome fear. Fear of other people being too good. You got to bring in great talent, right? Fear of other people being right and you being wrong. Fear of this won't work. Well, guess what? Most things won't work, and you'll pivot and you'll try other things. But you don't know that until you try it, right? It's all fear.
So true. You might even say that fear is the mind killer. I do think it's interesting, though, that the psychology research is that people are literally not capable of thinking creatively if they're in the nervous system state of fear. They're mutually incompatible. So I think that's a very common, very important thing. A lot of founders are confused about who their team is. And you have a great quote about this. You said that your team is the people you're willing to share rough drafts with. Explain.
If and only if. Think of all the people that you're willing to take an idea that is not fully formed and share it with. And I'll give you the most common founder example of this. Most founders want to present something to their board where the board goes, that is genius. Go do that. We have nothing more to add. That's perfect. Or subordinates to like whoever reports into the CEO, typically they want that atta boy or atta girl.
Yeah.
If typically what we look at as a successful board meeting is, did we get a ton of feedback from the board? Because if we didn't, we're not benefiting from the wisdom and experience of our amazing board. So that means that we have to show them something that isn't fully baked. And so that means that our board...
Speaking of fear.
Well, yeah, that's a fear. It's a fear that you might get criticism. We want, turn your fears around, start to crave the things that most people are afraid of. And then you will have an advantage. But your board is there to be part of your team. And if you are afraid to share something with your board, they're not a member of your team, things are broken. But it's bi-directional, right? They're not a member of your team if they're so critical that you can't share anything. And so your team is literally the people with whom you can brainstorm and before the ideas are good, get feedback and make the idea better. It's about being able to riff. You say something, then someone says, oh, this could be better. Oh, this could be, and you just go back and forth and the idea gets better. That's your team.
I love that definition. I got two more. Next one, this is something that I have always had on my engineering hiring rubric, and yet I have a hard time convincing other people to do it, and it's like surprisingly uncommon to me. You say it's really important to hire engineers with high empathy. Why?
It's funny you should say that. I'm about to do a talk in front of a bunch of students, and the entire focus of my talk is, do you see that chip right there? I didn't build it by myself. I built it with people. And the skill that no one teaches in engineering is how to work with other people. And there's so many things that we do wrong when we're interacting. They just don't teach it in an engineering course. But if you want to do things that are exceptional and extraordinary, you need other people. So empathy is and by the way, empathy typically means your ability to sense other people's emotions. That's a level that you have to get to. But then there's a more difficult level you have to get to, which is compassion. And the difference between empathy and compassion is empathy, you feel what others feel. And so that means when you have to go in there and give someone tough feedback, like it's not working out, and you know that that person is going to react poorly, that is worse for you than them. Why? Because what is worse than being tortured? It's the threat of torture. And all the way up until you have that meeting with that person, you're just thinking about how they're going to react poorly. And then all of a sudden you become afraid and you chicken out, right? Fear, you got to overcome that fear. Compassion it is really going to suck for me to give you this feedback and the thinking and the prepping before, but I'm going to do it because it's going to make you better. That's compassion. And being able to overcome your own fears, the pain of the threat of the torture of the empathetic response that you're going to get from the person giving feedback, that's something that you need to be training on if you want to become a world-class engineering leader.
Nothing to add to that. That's really well said. All right, last one. Because to me, like one of the most fascinating things about this machine learning revolution, obviously it's very exciting what we've learned about what machines are capable of, and obviously the new products we can build and the social impacts, and all it's very interesting. But to me, the most interesting thing philosophically about it has been what it reveals about the nature of human intelligence and human consciousness itself, and how many of our conventional ideas about what we call sentience is just basically totally wrong. and also how many abstract philosophical concepts are going to turn out to be empirically testable, which people would have said for millennia were, unfalsifiable hypotheses. Turns out are going to be all falsified. Anyway, I heard you say that you cannot have sentience without civilization. Explain that one.
All right, I'm going to say that, and then I'm going to say that and answer that, and then I'm going to explain my answer to should we be afraid of it of AI in that order.
Yeah.
So, first of all, to be able to have this discussion, we have to have a definition of sentience. And I'll just acknowledge straight up, there is no definition of sentience because it's a word that people started to use, and then different people have different interpretations. So I'm going to impose a definition on it. And I'm going to start off by saying the difference between sentience and intelligence is how smart you are, how capable you are at cognitive tasks. And sentience is your ability to get better at cognitive tasks. You can agree, you can disagree, but if you look at the way people use the word sentience, typically it is that self-awareness and it's that ability to improve and get better. So then if you look at sentience as that ability to improve, let's go back to the AlphaGo example. In the AlphaGo example, what you have is the world's best Go player, Lee Sedol, top 1 to 3, but he's up there. And he mastered his craft. And if you look at his ELO score, which is a measure of how good he is, how likely he is to win, it goes up very fast and then it sort of flattens out over time. Because it's really hard for a human being with a human brain to get better. And then a bunch of people who did something very different, built chips, came up with different AI algorithms, beat Lee Sedol. And so what you see is topical sentience, where Lee Sedol got better, but it wasn't linear. It was sublinear. So everyone's talking about was talking about the singularity. The singularity isn't guaranteed. We don't know what that arc of intelligence is. We don't know if it actually starts growing faster or if there's an S curve to it, or we're just assuming. But what I can tell you is there's this concept of general sentience, which is different than topical sentience. And what it does is it helps you get past the local minimum. Now, you can't even have intelligence without multicellular life. But here's the thing. Lee Sedol became one of the world's best Go players playing, but then a group of people were able to, with a more general sentience, beat him by building chips. But those chips, they were designed by my team and I, but the fabs were designed by another group. The materials were designed by other groups. And so just like we went from single cell to multicellular to get to intelligence, I don't know if a human being can be fully escape velocity sentient. I think every human being by themselves in a finite human lifetime flattens out. And so only a civilization has the cognitive capacity to be sentient in the sense of escape velocity. So that's why I think civilizations might be sentient, even though any individual human being may not be sentient in the sense of escape velocity, singularity kind of capability. Now, the next question I get asked a lot is, should we be afraid of AI? And my answer to that is, there's this guy who got in a lot of trouble, Galileo, because he made this telescope and he pointed it at the stars and he got some pretty good, like taking some data from other astronomers and what he had, he was able to put together a pretty convincing case that human beings were not the center of the universe. They locked him in a tower. And they did that because, again, they were afraid, right? If we weren't the center of the universe, that made us feel small. Large language models are the telescope of the mind. They give us this view of an intelligence that is quickly becoming larger and more vast than any single human being or even potentially civilization itself. And when you look at something that grand and that vast and that capable, it makes you feel small and afraid. But over time, we've gotten used to this idea that the universe is large and that we're small. And if anything, we've started to look at the beauty of the universe and how vast it is. And I think, and I hope that we start to look at intelligence and its vastness and its capability. And rather than being afraid that it could be much more than we are today, we look at the beauty of just how vast it can become.
That's a great place to end. Jonathan Ross, founder and CEO of Groq. What I think there's a reasonable chance it's going to be one of the iconic companies of this coming revolution. And so thank you for taking the time and sharing your thoughts and your story with all of us.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to The Eric Ries Show. The Eric Ries Show is produced by Jordan Bornstein and Kiki Garthwaite. Research by Tom White and Melanie Rehack. Visual design by Reform Collective. Title theme by DB Music. I'm your host, Eric Ries. Thanks for listening and watching. See you next time.